Hello, everybody, and welcome to a video where I'm going to be breaking down the seminal Magic the Gathering strategy article, The 4 Reasons You Won't 3-0 Your Next Draft by Paulo, Vitor, Damo, Rosa. Another way you could think of this article is 4 mistakes you are making in draft and how to fix them. Now, this is a really cool article and one that I have personally learned a lot from, but it's really hard to find on the internet these days, and I actually had to use the Wayback Machine to get to this one, and so I'm really excited to break it down for you, explain the examples for modern audiences who maybe don't understand the full context, and hopefully just provide a little clarity to this fantastic article that I really enjoy. If you've never heard of Paulo, Vitor, Damo, Rosa, he's one of the greatest Magic the Gathering players ever. He's a 2-time Pro Tour champion, a world champion, he's won Grand Prix, he's won at every single level, and he is regarded as one of the best players ever. So reading through his thoughts on the game is always a treat. Anyway, let's dive on in. He doesn't mince words here. Mistake number 1, you don't focus on learning the things that matter. If 2 decisions are very close, then it doesn't matter which one you make. This is a very important drafting concept that I learned from Ben Stark and Eric Froelich. Ben Stark and Eric Froelich are also great Magic players. 2 of the best drafters in the game. In my opinion, people focus too much on very small percentage differences, and it detracts from the things that actually make a difference. Take, for example, Shadows over Innistrad, and the discussion between Fiery Temper and Rabid Bite, depicted here. So, 3-mana red kill spell, 2-mana green kill spell. Most people seem to agree that these are the 2 best commons, but which one is better? Before the PT, which is Pro Tour, a friend of mine asked something like, "Please tell me which of the 2 is better, I must know." We have a big debate and we don't know who is right. The truth? I don't know. Does it matter? No, not really. The reason it doesn't matter is that whether you're right or wrong, you're only going to be right or wrong by a very small amount. Even if the cards aren't identical in value, one is a 7.235 and the other a 7.143, your expected deck is not going to be meaningfully worse or better if you have one or the other. Of course, in practice, one card might be much better than the other. You might be green and not red, in which case Rabid Bite is much better, for example, because Rabid Bite is green. But there is no way for you to know this when you're picking the card, so why bother? Having a big debate about which card is better when they are so close to each other is wasting time, and it's not something that needs settling. Pick one or pick the other. It makes no difference. This is a huge thing to think about in Magic the Gathering. You don't want to waste time on these, oh, I made one pick instead of the other type deals when they're really close picks. In a close pick, you can just be like, okay, either way, it's going to be fine for me. And unless you're fundamentally misevaluating the cards, which can happen, you don't have to feel bad about the way it works out. Like sometimes you're like, okay, the white card and the black card are equally good. I like both colors equally. I'll take the black card. And then the draft works out such that taking the white card would have been better. That's not worth wasting mental energy over. You just, if the pick is really close, you want to spend your time focusing on things that are really going to impact your draft. As a team, he's talking about Team Channel Fireball, I believe. I think we spend way too much time focusing on small differences. We will agree that a certain card is better than Fiery Temper. Oftentimes, pro teams view cards in the lens of which cards are better than the best commons, just as a easy metric for, okay, if I see this card, I don't have to even think about the commons. And worse, the Nearheath Chaplain, which is a pretty solid uncommon in this set. But then we will spend hours arguing whether it's exactly between Fiery Temper and Breakneck Rider, or whether it's between Breakneck Rider and Mad Prophet, when in practice it makes no difference. These are all just strong uncommons from this set, and the point he is making here is that arguing about whether like the exact ordering of these cards isn't going to make a huge difference because it's not super common that you'll see both of the cards in the same pack and have to pick between them, and when you do, it's going to be a close pick. And you aren't going to be that far wrong if you make the other one, whereas there's better things to spend your time on. Draft discussions should not aim to place each card in an exact spot. They should aim to give people an overview of the format and to make sure no one is horribly misevaluating a card. Everyone knows Fiery Temper is good, and there's no need to know precisely how good to the last decimal. But how about a card like Triskaidekaphobia or Startled Awake? These are just 2 really weird looking cards that are hard to evaluate if you've never played with them. I personally really liked Triskaidekaphobia decks. They were fun. Those are interesting to talk about because people have insanely different evaluations of them. At some point in our house drafts, which is the drafts that the Pro Tour team does as testing, so house draft is not a new format, it's just the Pro Tour team has a testing house and they call it a house draft when they draft together. Someone took Triskaidekaphobia over Accursed Witch, which was a card that people viewed as a good uncommon in that set. At another point, a player left the card in their sideboard. One of those players is making a huge mistake, and it's important to know which one. These are the sorts of big things that you can really gain from thinking about the important questions. At GP Barcelona, GP stands for Grand Prix, someone asked, what's the best card in the set? And a friend of mine on another team replied, either Avacyn, which is like a game-ending angel, or Startled Awake. Startled Awake is a card I consider to be worse than most good commons. So if it's in fact the best card in the set, I'm making a huge mistake by not taking it, one that you should look to prevent. And likewise for my friend if it's not very good. This is a discussion worth having. Again, focus on the big picture things that are really important. More than individual cards, I think draft discussions should be focused on the fundamentals of a format. It's impossible to memorize every decision you have to make because the context is always different. So it's much better to try to understand what is going on so that you can make informed decisions out of the blue. Things I like to learn in a format. Are aggressive decks good? Are defensive decks good? How big are attackers and blockers? How big are the pump spells? Is flying great? How important is it to be able to kill creatures? Are there a lot of utility creatures? Are there a lot of pingers? Pingers are creatures that tap to deal 1 damage to creatures, which makes 1 toughness creatures worse as a result. How fragile are your creatures? Fragile means easy to kill, so like things with 1 toughness and things like that. Is it possible to draft archetype XYZ if you do not open rares? Should you look to draft them if you do open the rare, or only if it falls into your lap? Is the set synergy-based or power-based? How early should you commit? Should you be reactive or proactive? Is it the kind of set where you will first pick a card and play it regardless of what else happens, like Fate Reforged, which was a set that was widely regarded as very bomby and had a lot of really good rares? Or is it the kind of set where you should quickly abandon your first pick if things don't look like they're turning out okay, like Battle for Zendikar, which Paulo later talks about in this article as being a set he viewed as a very synergistic set? Is it a set where you have a lot of ways to splash and often end up in multiple colors? Does that mean you should prioritize gold cards? Gold cards are another word for multicolored cards. Or is it a set where you often lack the means to splash, which means committing to 2 colors early on is much more costly? And the reason why he says that it's much more costly to commit to 2 colors early on in a set with less fixing is that you don't have the option of picking up a 3rd color that's more open and then splashing your good cards. So let's just say you start in a red-green deck. If there's a lot of, or let's just say red-blue deck. If green ends up being open, then maybe you would want to, in an ideal world, play red, green, splash, blue. But if there's no fixing, then you're kind of in a tough spot because you're drafting your blue-red deck and green's open, and then you end up in a mix where it's like, I have not enough playables. So that's why fixing can make it like you get more punished sometimes for committing to 2 colors more early. Which is why he says committing to 2 colors early is much more costly if you lack the means to splash. Just to clarify that. In my opinion, these are the kinds of questions that should be answered if you're trying to learn the format. It's more important to know this than to know whether Fiery Temper is better than Rabid Bite, because this information will impact your draft, your deck, and your record a lot more. So, point number 1. You don't focus on learning the things that matter. So, focus on the things that matter. Mistake number 2. You don't abandon your first picks often enough. One mistake that people often make is to become married to their first picks. This will result in a great deck when things work out, and a horrible deck when they don't. We've all had that draft where you first pick a red card, the best card in the next pack is red, then there's a pack with nothing but a great blue card, then the next pack has a blue-red rare. Those drafts are great. If you get a draft like this, you don't have to think much. You just follow some semblance of a pick order, stick to those colors, and your deck will turn out awesome. A lot of the time you have drafts like this, and you think of yourself as a master drafter. But the reality is that anyone in your spot would have had the same deck because you didn't really have to make any decisions. You just got lucky that things worked out your way. The really hard drafts are the ones where you first pick a red card, second pick a red card, then there's a pack with nothing but blue, then a pack where the best card is green, then a pack with a green-white rare that is great, or a red card that is mediocre. In those drafts, you have to be able to judge how committed you are to a color and whether you can afford to change or at least to remain flexible. This is, in my opinion, the hardest part of drafting, and I think most people err on the side of sticking to their first picks too much. Yes, Always Watching, which is a card that buffs your entire team by +1/+1 and gives them vigilance, it's a great card, but it's not worth being white for, as it's better to have a deck full of 7s without it than a deck full of 5s with one Always Watching. When he says 7s, he's referring to power level. So if you say your deck is filled with 7s, it means your deck has a lot of 7 out of 10s. And if he says a deck is full of 5s, it means your deck is filled with a lot of 5 out of 10s. So, but he's basically saying is it's better to have good cards across the board rather than have one really good card and a bunch of mediocre cards. In general, people overvalue their first pick and undervalue their second, third, and fourth picks, which are much more important because those are the cards that the person passing to you did not take. This is a hugely important concept. You can't get a signal from the pack that you open because you opened it. You have no information on what the other person is doing. If you get past a card that has a good red card in it, you know that the person passing it to you did not take the good red card. Now, maybe they took an even better red card, but the odds are more likely that they took a good card in a different color because it's less likely that there's going to be 2 great red cards that they had in the pack. That's just how it generally works with signal reading. And if you consistently see those sorts of signals, you can maybe get a sense for what colors are open. It's common for someone drafting to first pick a red card and then pass a good green card because this card is not good in red-green, or red-green is not a good combination in this format. Those people act as if they're already in red because they have 1 or 2 good red cards that they picked super early. But the reality is that they aren't in red yet, or at least shouldn't be. If I get it past a card like Dauntless Cathar, 7th pick, which was a good common in that set, that is a much stronger argument for being white than simply first picking Descend Upon the Sinful, which was a very good mythic rare in that set. Basically what he's saying is because he got past the really good common 7th pick, he has much more of a signal versus Descend Upon the Sinful being a card he opened being not a signal at all. So remember, mistake number 2 to avoid, you don't abandon your first picks often enough, so be more willing to abandon your first picks. Mistake number 3, you don't value flexibility as much as you should early on. I think that people overvalue cards that are great in one particular strategy, while undervaluing cards that are solid all the time. You see this with gold cards, again this means multicolored cards, or colorless cards. I believe this is a consequence of overvaluing your first pick. If you assume you're already that color, or combination of colors, then this makes sense. But it's not good to assume that. The big philosophy here is that cards are worth differing amounts, but cards you do not play in your deck are always worth 0. This is a huge point to keep in mind. The cards you do not play in your deck are always worth 0. Take, for example, a first pick decision between Arlen Cord, which is a red-green planeswalker, or Mad Prophet, which is this 4-drop, which was also in Shadows over Innistrad, even though this is the original printing of it, which has a different artwork, which is it was a good 4-drop in this set. You'll just have to trust me on this. If it looks underpowered now, there was a mechanic called Madness, which made this better, and also just the magic was different back then. This card was good. I believe Arlen Cord is, in a vacuum, the more powerful card, but it's 2 colors. In this spot, Mad Prophet is a good enough card that I will take it as it's only 1 color. If you're assigning values, I'd say Mad Prophet is a 7 and Arlen Cord is an 8. But Mad Prophet is a 7 that you will play 60% of the time, and Arlen Cord is an 8 that you will only play, say, 40% of the time. He gets into how he gets these numbers a little bit later. If you average those amounts, you get Mad Prophet to be worth 4.2, which is just multiplying 7 times 60%, and Arlen Cord to be worth 3.2, which is 8 times 40%. Even if you really push yourself to red-green, because you have Arlen Cord, it's likely still worth less. In practice, I believe those numbers to be even lower. 40% of all decks are red, and around 10% of all decks should be red-green, all things equal. But I'm increasing those percentages a little bit to account for color strength in a set, and the fact that you're more likely to be a certain color or combination while already having that card, plus splashes, which you're more incentivized to do with the more powerful card. So what he's basically saying is that Mad Prophet will be played in your deck 60% of the time, because when you have Mad Prophet in your deck, you're going to bias your deck towards red, and Arlen Cord will make your deck 40% of the time because you'll bias towards red-green if you have it. So even though in like perfect numbers you'd have a red-green deck 10% of the time, you don't have to use that exact math when calculating on gold cards because you will bias towards them, especially if they're good enough. And similarly, you're going to bias towards your red card that's good. In practice, I believe those numbers are even lower. We already talked about that. Okay, the main idea here is that you play Mad Prophet almost twice as much as you play Arlen Cord, and Arlen does not add nearly twice as much value to you when you do play it to make up for that. You can also see this is kind of like a don't swing for the fences type approach. It's better to get a double every time than a home run once and then strike out 3 times kind of vibe, because you won't play the Arlen, and as we already said, cards you do not play in your deck are always worth 0. You can also see this when evaluating cards like Westvale Abbey, which is a powerful land that has an activated ability and it's colorless. I do not think Abbey is a fantastic card. It's merely good, but I would still first pick it over most things because it goes in any deck. A 6 that I will play in any deck is better than a 7 that I will play 60% of the time by a lot. So again, 6 out of 10 card, 7 out of 10 card. Most of the people on my team disagreed with this and found Abbey to be a lower pick for them than it was for me. I would take it over any common, for example, and they would take cards like Temper, which is the Fiery Temper we already talked about, and Bite, which is Rapid Bite. over it, which are the two best commons we've already established from earlier in this article, which I think reflects a difference in our drafting philosophies. So mistake number 3, you don't value flexibility as much as you should early on, so correct that by valuing flexibility more early in your drafts. Mistake number 4, you don't gamble at the right time. I think people adopt a risky approach when they should be safe, and a safe one when they should be bold. People will gamble with their first picks when the opportunity cost is high, but they will not gamble with their later picks when the benefits are huge and the opportunity costs are low, which is exactly when you should be gambling. During our draft discussions for Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad, we were evaluating the card Angel of Deliverance, which is this 8 mana 6/6 flyer that has like huge value if it hits them and you have Delirium. As most 8 mana creatures without an enters the battlefield trigger tend to be, it was ranked pretty low. No one would take it over any of the top commons. I think this is correct. Most people said they would take the mediocre playables over it, say for example Strength of Arms, which is just fairly solid combat trick, like 1 mana +2/+2, minor upside over that, pretty common trick you'd get in white. I think this is wrong. The reason for this is that Angel is a high risk, high reward card, and Strength of Arms is replaceable. You will often not play the Angel of Deliverance, but when you have it in your pile, it enables you to draft a sort of slow deck that, without a rare like it, is just not viable. Sure, one of the reasons he says this is because generally, if you don't have a really good rare in the late game, you'll come up against an opposing deck that is also trying to play control, that just has a really good haymaker that you can't necessarily beat. So that's sometimes like, oh, if I don't have any really good late game card, I can't necessarily go to control as easily. You can still draft control without really good rares, but this is just like something like, okay, having a late game rare makes my control decks a lot better. And so it's just high upside in that situation. Sure, you don't want to draft this deck in an ideal world, but you can draft this deck because you took that Angel. And if you somehow do end up in that deck, it will be much better because you have it. Angel is risky because even in a lot of white decks, it's not good. It's like a gold card. Remember, this means multicolored card. I'd say that you will play it maybe 20% of all white decks, perhaps even less. So 20% of all white decks, not 20% of all decks. That's an important distinction from how he's been doing things a bit. When you do play it though, it'll most likely be instrumental to your deck. When you sideboard it in, it will be very good. If you assume it's a 7 in the right deck, it gets an overall grade of 1.4, assuming you are white. Now let's take Strength in Arms. It's a solid combat trick, so it gets a 5. You will play it in, say, 70% of your white decks, which gives it an overall value of 3.5, if you're playing white, over twice as much as the Angel. Yet I pick the Angel. Why? I'm really glad he makes this point because it really helps keep people away from just purely sticking to avoiding mistake number 3 and falling into another trap. So I'm really glad he's making this point here. He says, yet I pick the Angel. Why? Because Strength of Arms is replaceable. Replaceable is a key word to think about when you're drafting. The choice is not to play Strength of Arms or a red card you can't cast. It's to play Strength of Arms or whichever your 24th best card is. A lot of the time, your 25th best white card will be a 4.9. In this, and remember he said Strength of Arms was a 5.0. In this case, by playing Strength of Arms instead, you're increasing your deck's power by only a tiny bit. But it's not adding 5 to your deck's value, it's adding 0.1 because you have to compare it to what you'd be replacing it with. The Angel, on the other hand, will be substantially better than your 24th best card in the right deck because it does something that is not emulated by any commons, being a late game finisher that has abilities that only are on rares at that time pretty much. And again, having the Angel will let you draft that deck to begin with. This same train of thought should be used when drafting sideboard cards. It's usually better to take a good sideboard card over a replacement level common because the replacement level common is exactly that, replaceable. It will make a marginal impact in your deck as opposed to the next best card you have, whereas the sideboard card will be much better when it is good. Another time that you can use this philosophy is when determining whether to draft like lands that tap for both of your colors. So for example, if you are in a green-white deck and there's a common land that comes into play tapped and taps for green or white, if you put that card into your deck and then then you get the extra upside of playing a better land, and you're not actually risking that much if you're taking it over a replacement level card because there's a lot of playable cards in Magic the Gathering these days. And so taking the lands a little bit higher can be really nice because it gives you more consistent mana and it's not going to be a huge detriment to your deck's power level because you're doing the same thing where you're replacing a card that's like a 5 out of 10 with like a 4.9 out of 10. And so that's just something to be aware of is when you have these replaceable level cards, you should be looking for better, like even more situational cards like good sideboard cards or things like that to take over them. I also like to use this philosophy when deciding if I should stay flexible or not. Take, for example, my second draft at Pro Tour Battle for Zendikar, PTBFZ. The focus here is my 5th pick. I start with Nettle Drone, which is a red card. Even though it's technically devoid, so that would mean it was colorless, but it's a red card. Follow it with Ugin's Insight, which is a blue card, McKindy Slide Runner, which is a red card, and Rising Miasma out of a very weak pack. So he's gone red card, red card, black card. Then, next pack, I have the choice between a solid red card, Valakut Invoker, or Catacomb Sifter, which is a green-black card. I took Catacomb Sifter. A lot of people approached me asking why I had taken that, and the reason was that I thought Valakut Invoker was an acceptable cost for the chance to play Catacomb Sifter. In my mind, Battle for Zendikar is a synergy-based set. It's reactive, which means you generally want to be answering things and having removal, and you want to position yourself in open archetype so you can get powerful cards that no one else wants super late, like Calastria Healer, for example. This was one of my favorite cards to draft in that set. This one's really sweet, but it's like an ally payoff, which is only good in specific decks. Usually it was black-white in that format, which was, I think, the best color combination, if I recall correctly. Green is bad in this format. That's maybe an understatement. There were some people who said green was so bad you should literally never draft it. But yeah, I think you could still draft it. But yeah, green is bad in this format, so just keeping that in mind. But black-green is a deck that you can draft, especially if you're the only one drafting it. It's possible that, in a given draft table, there is a very powerful black-green deck to be drafted by exactly one person. When the Catacomb Sifter pick, what the Catacomb Sifter pick does for me here is to make sure that if such a deck exists, I will be the person drafting it. At this point in time, I'm not committed to anything. I have a couple of decent cards, and that's it. I have no reason to lock myself into red. Taking the Valakut Invoker would have been the easier way. I'd just take a bunch of red after that and choose a second color. But I believe it would have been the wrong way. If I take the Invoker, I pass on the opportunity to draft the black-green deck, and that is perhaps the deck I should be in. Yes, it is overwhelmingly more likely that I end up playing the Invoker than the Catacomb Sifter, but the difference between the Invoker and my 24th best card, the reason he says 24th here, is because you have 23 playables in your deck, and so the 24th card is another common slot for like first card off the bench. My 24th best card is small enough that it's definitely worth gambling with the Sifter. As it turned out, I never took another green or black card again and ended up blue-red. But my deck still ended up okay, and because I took that Catacomb Sifter, I would have been in a good position to draft the black-green deck if things turned out that way. So he doesn't have a little wrap-up here on the article, but the last point is you don't gamble at the right time, and he's talking about during the draft portion, when you should be willing to take the high upside pick over the card that is maybe more consistent but mediocre. So that is going to do it for this article breakdown, the 4 reasons you won't 3-0 your next draft. I really do hope you enjoyed it. If you did make it all the way to the end of this video, leave hashtag 4fixes, because these are hopefully 4 things you can fix in your draft so that you can do better. So hashtag 4fixes to let me know you made it to the end of the video. Hit that thumbs up button, subscribe for more videos like this one, and I will talk to you next time.